brand new month in K-Town Kids, and that means we've got something brand new to talk about. Why don't you ask our AV team if they can show us what we've got on our plate for this month? Little guys, help us. Forgiveness is deciding that someone who has wronged you doesn't have to pay. Now be honest with me, how many of you have ever been mad at someone and decided to get even? Yeah, me too. This month, we're going to be talking about resisting the urge to dole out some payback and instead have a heart of forgiveness. Today, we're going to be looking at a story Jesus told way back in the day, found in the book of Luke chapter 15. Luke is at the beginning of the New Testament, and it's one of the books that tells the story of Jesus' life. Now Jesus, he liked to hang out with people like tax collectors and sinners, and he wanted to show them that everybody deserves God's love. But the Pharisees, a group of high and mighty religious leaders at the time, thought less of Jesus for hanging out with such people. They thought it wasn't okay to associate with people who were considered low in social status. So one day, as Jesus was eating dinner with a group of sinners, a gang of Pharisees showed up and started saying things like, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Jesus called the Pharisees over to join the group, and he began to tell a story of a young man who, well, why don't I just show you instead? Let's call him Dan. Could I please get a volunteer to be Dan? Alrighty. Now our friend Dan was the son of a farmer who owned some land and lots of animals. Dan lived comfortably under his father's wing with his hard-working, diligent brother.
Yep, that's me, hard-working and diligent.
But Dan grew bored of sitting around on the farm day after day, so he went to ask his father if he could have his inheritance in advance. Much to Dan's surprise, his father said,
"Hey, sure thing, son. Let me go get that for you. Be back in a jiffy."
Say what? You just gonna give him his inheritance? That's unbelievable.
Now let me take just a second to emphasize how rude it was for Dan to say this to his dad. You see, back then, you would only receive your inheritance once your father passed away. However, his dad was still alive. What he was basically saying was, "Hey Dad, if you were dead, I could have your cash right now." But do you think Dan was thinking about how rude he was being when he saw that cash being put into his hands? No, sir. Dan could scarcely believe his luck. All this time living under his father's supervision, and now he could go hog wild. He immediately rushed out and started spending his sudden riches on anything he could get his hands on. The latest fashion, the most expensive jewelry, and of course, the best food money could buy. Do you like ice cream, Dan?
Oh yeah.
Well, could you have all the ice cream you can eat now? How about some hot dogs, Dan? There's kosher. Everyone likes kosher hot dogs. Well, Dan, here you go. Now, of course, you'll need something to wash all that down with. How about everyone's favorite, ice blue Gatorade? It's actually the Frost, the best. Yep, life was good for Dan. Of course, after living so large, it wasn't long before Dan found himself a little short on cash. He had spent every penny of his inheritance and was struggling to even make enough money to feed himself. Desperate for any way to make a little dough, Dan hired himself out to a local pig farmer who put him to work slopping the pigs. Now, for those of you who may not know, pig slop usually consisted of the leftover of the day's meal. Pigs aren't all that picky after all, so they are more than happy to eat, say, some ice cream mixed with some hot dog and a healthy helping of blue Gatorade.
No.
Slop. Dan had a choice to make now. Not only was he broke, he was hungry. And the more he worked with those piggies, the more appetizing that slop began to look. How about it, Dan? Want a sip of some slop?
No.
Hey, suit yourself. Dan couldn't live this way any longer, so he made a decision. He had to go back to his father and beg his forgiveness. In Luke 15, 18, and 19, it says the son planned to say to his dad, "Father, I have sinned against I have sinned against heaven, and I have sinned against you. I am no longer be fit to call your son. Make me like one of your hired workers." He couldn't imagine his dad would have food to eat and a roof over his head. So Dan set out on the road to his father's house. When he got there, Dan spotted his dad in the distance. Whoa, man, what's Dad's going to say? What is Dad going to do? Well, if you want to find out how this dad reacted to his son's return home, be sure to come back next week for the exciting conclusion. Give it up for Dan, everybody, and the younger brother. Thanks for helping us out with the story. The story Jesus told was a parable, which is a made-up story to make a point, to teach people something. In the parable, we are like the younger son, and God is like the father. The younger son made several huge mistakes, just like we do. It's easy to look at the younger son and point out all the things he did wrong. But if we think about it, we do lots of things wrong too, don't we? When we do something wrong that God says not to do, it's called sin. And that sin creates a giant distance between us and God. The younger son came to understand that he needed to make the wise decision and head home to ask for forgiveness. It seemed like he had gotten our bottom line. Everyone needs to be forgiven, even me. We too need to ask for forgiveness from God, our Father, for all we have done against Him in our lives. And one of the awesome things about God is that He is there waiting to forgive us, no matter how much we have done wrong. However, before God forgives us, we must believe in Him. God forgives those who believe Jesus died on the cross and took the punishment for our sin. The question is, what do you believe? Let's pray.